Hey everybody, good morning or afternoon, whenever it is that you're watching this. This is Liam Bowler. I'm in my office here in Missoula with my tea and my pelvis. Well, two that we'll get to in a second. This video I'm making and putting up public in hopes that it'll be helpful for those that are interested. And this is largely a follow-up to a class that I taught last night, a series class called Like Yoga But Different. And we spent a lot of time, pretty much the whole class, focusing on the hips and sacrum, pelvic bowl, lumbar region of the body. And that, we opened up class by saying this is an entry point into the whole body, that any movement is a whole body movement. And there's that, I don't know if the Buddha actually said this, but I have in my head that the Buddha said something about the universe being contained in a grain of sand, rice, I don't know. The infinite and the finite. And certainly I think that's a good analogy here. So that said, we got to a movement that was, or a position that was interesting and hard to find for a lot of people in the class, and it certainly has been for me. So I want to make a video that talked about that, and that is, and I'll show it on my little buddy here, this is the pelvis, facing forward. This lumbar sacral region, almost like an infinitely thin line, and I don't know, I feel a little shy often like putting this in sort of biomechanical terms, because for me that doesn't totally speak to it, but anyway, as long as we're talking about anatomy, right, engaging that, lengthening through not only the lumbar region, which we could call this whole sort of lower abdomen, lower back, but in particular, there's a line of, I get the image of sort of where heaven and earth come together, where your legs and roots meet your torso and shoulders, and sort of more human, perhaps, expressions, and what goes down, it tends to be more dense. And we can talk about this for an hour, but I'll get to the movement here in a second. And I guess just last thing I'd say on that is also the home of the lower chakras. And I don't know exactly where these things, where they exist, but certainly like our center of gravity, Dantian, the Hara, sometimes in the martial arts, and the second chakra, which we collectively, it seems like, as a species, and certainly here in the Western world, are going through a pretty important evolution and revolution around some like second chakra issues around power and sex. And anyway, so wherever along this, all the things I just said, this speaks to you. And the gist of it is, in this video, is how to engage that. Anatomically, just know you can go into a very deep back bend. I've seen and worked with yogis who can go into very deep back bends and still are very stuck and limited at this particular line. So just spend a minute with the anatomy of it. I'll scoot back so you can see. You see my butt? Yeah. Right, so I'm talking about being able to move the pelvis, but a big way of expressing that, if I'm flexing my spine, and right here's obviously a bit of overkill, where I can tuck. But as I get more isolated, things get more subtle. If I'm thinking about just this neighborhood, how to not only move my pelvis, but how would I engage this way where it actually kind of blooms open like a flower, or creates space, facilitates the opening of the space that's there. And I know this video is kind of rambling, but I'm going to keep going with it, because I feel like if you've made it this far, you're with me. This isn't a sort of do these 3 exercises for your back. What this is, in my experience, is a very gets to the root of the flavor of something that you can bring to those 3 exercises you do for your back, that you can bring to your yoga practice, to your dance, to any really to any movement in this really, important neighborhood. So what we did last night, people sit on a block, Finding your sits bones. I don't remember what this is called in yoga, but kind of a setup to, the straight leg, bend forward. Which we often think of as like hamstring mobility, yeah? With or without the block. What people do is bend your knees up to about 90 degrees here. Too much, and there tends to be some like effort and, lots of effort in the hip flexors. And too little, and there's actually still too much tension through here. So I want to make everything sit as easy as I can. Opening my legs into kind of a modified Baddha Konasana will facilitate that as well. And I was going around cueing people, but you can feel on your own back. If you feel your sits bones and feeling like the whole pelvis is having that forward tilt, that anterior tilt, in relation to your low back. So it's subtle, right? Here's me without it engaged, and here's me engaging it. So this is like that line is working right now for me. I'm not positive about this, but I said last night, and I'm pretty sure that when we talk about getting the multifidi to fire, if you're familiar with the anatomy, this is that. The tiny fan of erector tissues, which are so innervated and intermingled with the thoracolumbar fascia and blah, blah, blah. Certainly the sacrum. Anyway, so having this engaged here. And from here, so one, you're just finding it, right? Can you find, and I would start with visualizing. It's not a big movement. It's not an anterior tilt, right? Because there go all my lumbars. I just want to talk to this particular line in this space. And my hunch is, and my feeling is, you'll know when you feel it. So thinking about, like, can I lift my lumbar spine off of my sacrum and bring the whole thing kind of, it's ultimately into neutral, but it feels like relative to the way most of us are patterned. And I wouldn't think if you're normally posterior or anteriorly tilted, in my experience, that doesn't apply to you needing to tuck back or forward here. All of us lift in this sort of forward way along this line. Knees open and bent, relaxed. From here, I start to draw my knees in towards the midline, feeling for, you can use your hand or your proprioception, interoception, or both. Feeling for, I'll make the movement big. Feeling for that. But it's not going to look big, right? It will be much more subtle. So for me, I start to lose it and my sacrum starts to shrink here. And that's where I want to be. I can sort of play with that, think about that length. I'm drawing my knees in. Eventually I can start to straighten them a bit more. Right? So my heels are on the ground. I'm bringing my knees towards one another a bit. But again, like here's me with it engaged, this line. And here's me losing it. It's so hard to tell from the outside. Engaged, gone. Right? And eventually, this is heading towards a forward fold, which I can't demonstrate very well with the whole thing. I mean, if my feet are on the ground, my knees are definitely bent. I'm finding that lift through here. That said, I can have my legs straight and, like in traditional range of motion, like, I don't know, somewhere in the middle, I'm doing fine, right? But still, these like upper hamstring fibers into the lumbosacral region. Knees open or external rotation of the hips to facilitate some more room through here so I can feel it and find it. And then I start to draw that in and lengthen. I loved looking around the room last night. Everyone had their hands like this. It was like this Tai Chi thing. Because we talked about it like that. Like, forget about anatomy. Think about these energetic lines opening up. And, we'll make sense of the anatomy later. We can talk about it later. So everyone was like this. It was cool. But growing length from this space. I know I keep showing it with my head, but it's here. Right? And then bringing in. The next step would be I'm straightening out my legs. Final step would be starting to hinge forward at the hips into something like a forward bend. Develop the taste for this. I mean, two things. One, develop the taste for this and bring maybe not even that level of nuance, but that kind of general feel to something like a forward bend, to downward dog. Lots of people can put their heels on the floor, press super long through their whole back body, and that lumbosacral region, butt up in the air, right? This will be kind of stuck in compression and flexion. So backing way out of the pose, right? A lot of the times if you're doing yoga, the instructor might cue you to bend your knees and lift your sits bones. That's kind of a like gross anatomical way to, or a big cue to guide a class towards maybe something like this. And it's so easy to ignore because it's not that big of a change in range of motion. If anything, I mean, we're talking about fractions of millimeters. Sometimes, an analogy I sometimes give is, the difference between if you were hovering a quarter of a millimeter above a chair versus sitting in the chair. Range of motion, very little changed, but your whole experience changes hugely. This is one of those things. So, and the second thing I would offer is the deeper this tissue goes, the more to me it gets like a koan, which is a word in Zen, or I've just heard in Zen, to describe a question that's meant to bring you in deeper into an experience. It does have an answer, but it's not, meant to have a quick sort of conscious mind answer, right? It's meant to draw you in deep. And this, for me, is an area that it easily feels like a koan. It's meant to draw you into movement practice as a way to draw you into knowing yourself. So that said, maybe with it on the spectrum of like listening and moving versus like an athletic kind of go get 'em, generally that listening will facilitate that koan better. Doesn't mean you just sit there, right? There's a lot happening, but if something burns,